Hello, I'm Joe Malord, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. Even though the wages of American workers have seen significant increases compared to just a year ago, those gains have been compromised by the increased cost of household goods. Joining me to discuss the impact of inflation on workers and their finances is Ross Mack. He is a financial literacy coach and host of Revolt TV's Maconomics. He also spent several years in private banking at Morgan Stanley, among other Wall Street institutions, and before then earned his bachelor's degree from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Ross, welcome to the show.
Joe, thanks for having me, man. I truly appreciate it.
Of course. Now we know you make your living rather in breaking down financial concepts to people. So let's start off here. What's the easiest way to understand inflation?
Great question, right? I think a lot of people have been hearing about inflation, a lot of headlines, but at the end of the day, inflation in layman's terms is a rise in prices of the rise in prices of goods over time. So in other words, think of it like what $100 5 years ago could buy, you couldn't necessarily buy it today. So think of it literally saying your purchasing power declines over time. Where right now we're just in a more hyper, exacerbated situation where inflation is actually starting to kick in a little more, though. So if you actually think about it, back in the day when your parents or grandparents could go get gas for a nickel, we can even come close to getting that. Or better yet, when you were a kid, you could go to the corner store with $1 and get 3-4 bags of chips, a few things. Now just $1 gets you one bag of chips and maybe a 10-cent bag to actually put it in. So inflation over time continues to rise, but right now we're just experiencing highly elevated levels of inflation.
Right, and I was putting gas in my car the other day, and I can tell you that gas is a little bit over a nickel per gallon right now. So, let's talk about that. How are the current trends of inflation affecting the average person, and why do you think it's gotten to this level where it seems to be a trending topic in the news, like one of the most significant news stories?
Yeah, so inflation obviously is an issue for the average everyday consumer. One of the reasons is because your purchasing power is going down. So literally a year ago, first today, you could probably go to your grocery store, your corner store, whatever it is, you're going to start seeing goods actually increasing. When there was a shortage on chicken wings, for instance, you literally are now going to the grocery store and you're going to have to pay elevated prices to actually buy chicken wings, whether it's seafood, lumber prices, etc. So what ended up happening to the consumer is that you start to feel, you start feeling that in your pocket, because now it's going to cost you more money to actually live the same life you had just a year ago or even 2 years ago, for that matter. And that's because of inflation. So whether it was supply chain issues, which, so many things have happened with factories having to shut down workers due to COVID, et cetera, or better yet, so many shipping ports actually being understaffed and a lot of material actually not being able to be fulfilled when it comes to, distributing everything. So what you start to see is prices of all these goods start to increase because, when you have the same exact demand for something, but the supply is down, the prices have to go up.
Mm. And I want to stop and take a moment to say hello to everyone who's watching in the stream. We have Christine from New York City, Sherry from Ohio, and William from Georgia. Thanks for watching, and thanks for everyone else who's tuning in. Let's get to something else that I think people might not have the best grasp of, even though we hear it in the news all the time, and that is the role the Federal Reserve here plays. We know that there's some activity that they engage in to respond to inflation. Can you give an example of what that is and why it's important for the average person to understand it?
Well, I would say the average person probably doesn't necessarily, need to know about it. But if you were, right, at the end of the day, the Federal Reserve is the bank of the U.S. government, right? And one of the things they do is try to, curb inflation. They try to keep investor morale. They try to keep consumer confidence. And so when we were in the midst of coronavirus and everyone was under the impression that, the world was going to end, jobs were having to shut down. There were, at one point over 30 million people being laid off. One thing that the government tried to do was say, you know what, let's find a way to make Americans feel as though they still have more money. We're just going to continue to pump money into the economy. And at that time, they were buying $120 billion worth of treasury notes as well as municipal bonds per month. And what that was doing was actually keeping interest rates low. So when interest rates are low, that makes us as consumers feel as though we have more money in our pocket. Why? One, because we can borrow money for a lot cheaper. We can finance cars. We can, get a mortgage for much cheaper. And what ended up happening with that is when there's just so much money pumped into the economy, unfortunately, it can have an adverse effect. And that adverse effect is inflation. So now when there's so much money being pumped into the economy, right, if all of us just randomly get $100,000, well, guess what? The prices of goods also have to rise, because, if everyone got richer by $100,000, and therefore the price of goods themselves should also increase. And so now what you're seeing is that one way that the actual Federal Reserve has the ability to actually curb inflation is now by actually rising interest rates. And that's one thing that the actual stock market is looking towards, because they're trying to see, in the event they rise interest rates, that right there would actually make the average consumer feel, not as willing to go out and borrow money, right? That would curb investments, et cetera. But that in turn would actually help keep inflation from rising to even more elevated levels.
Well, on that note, we actually have an interesting question in the stream from Tiffany in North Carolina, who asks, will any of these trends have an effect on 401ks and investments? How do these trends impact, those accounts that people have?
Great question. What I say to most people, right, when you're looking at your retirement, you obviously want to be very cognizant of what your investment horizon is. So a person that's 20 years old, 30 years old, and you're not looking to truly, benefit from your 401k or your IRA until you're, close to 60 years old, over time, I wouldn't really even consider it. I wouldn't be concerned at all. However, to a person that's maybe rising in their age and they're getting close to their, actual retirement, the way you would actually look at that is say, when interest rates rise, that may in turn make your equities come down slightly. And what I mean by that is, when interest rates are low, that is making other investments not as attractive. That being corporate bond investments, municipal bond investments, as well as government securities. However, equities, as a result, when you have seen interest rates actually be at record lows, you're actually seeing equities at record highs, right? So right now, currently, the stock market is at all-time highs. However, if inflation does become an issue and the government moves to, and that being the Federal Reserve, to stay, to bring it all back home, if the Federal Reserve was to find a way to say, let us curb inflation and actually raise interest rates, well, that might have a small impact on your equities. However, if you're a long-term investor, I would not even be that concerned about it.
All right, so let's get to another topic. You're big on talking about financial independence, and one of the ways in which people feel as though they can achieve that is by starting a small business or getting into a side hustle. What's one mistake that you would advise people to avoid when they're thinking about how they're going to accomplish this for themselves?
Great question. When you are thinking about going into a side hustle, one thing I always say is that you don't have to fully quit your first job in order to, dedicate that much time to your side hustle. I look at, working a normal 9 to 5 as the opportunity to actually finance your side hustle, right? And once your side hustle gets to be very lucrative and you actually need to demand more hours, then potentially you might want to actually leave your actual main job. However, one thing I tell people is that when you're actually going into your actual side hustle, one thing I would always say is make sure you're properly protected. One way to do that is actually having a LLC, a limited liability corporation. And the reason that's important is because it removes the individual liability. So if someone wanted to sue you, or better yet, sue your business, and you don't actually have an LLC, well, they can actually come after your personal assets. But if you do have an LLC, well, the most they could actually do is just go after the business, right? And another thing I actually like when it comes to, LLCs is because it gives you the ability to write off many deductions, right? When you come to actually having qualified deductions due to, what your side hustle is, for instance, if you were to do hair in your house, right? At the end of the day, if you're using your phone to actually call clients, a portion of your phone bill can be written off at the end of the year. Right? If you are doing hair in your home, well, one of the actual things is that now your home is your office. So a proportion of what your actual rent is, depending on how big your office is, you can actually write that off. And those are just some small things. But at the end of the day, when it comes to side hustle, we are in a new a completely different world, right? We're in the gig economy. There's so many different ways of finding side hustles. I always just say, write it down. Make sure you have a ton of savings, right? And when I mean savings, just make sure you have an emergency fund. That way you can help stomach any down months or anything when it comes to your business. But at the end of the day, have a great plan. Make sure you're protected with an LLC and, go get it, right? At the end of the day, the only way to do it is just to actually do it. And I think, and I welcome anyone when it comes to a side hustle. I think it's a very great opportunity to, find extra methods of having some type of income.
Right. And last week on this very show, one of my colleagues, George Anders, was talking about the amount of people that are considering changing industries. That's another big move that people are thinking about. Somewhere over 50% of people that LinkedIn surveyed. For those who are thinking of this type of change, what are some things they should consider while trying to finance this big move? Because for some people, it might require being out of work for maybe a couple of months if, they want to join the Great Resignation or whatever the case is.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. The way I look at that is everything at the end of the day starts with a very solid budget plan. Once again, anybody looking, you could go in my bio and download my free budget template. And the reason I say it's important is because I think that's the first step of being truly financially free. And the reason I say start with the budget is because that's going to give you the ability to now start budgeting and, more importantly, understand where all your inflows and outflows are going. Because one of the things I stated earlier was actually having a fully funded emergency fund. And what that is actually having your necessary expenses and on average having 3 to 6 months of that. So if you are a person that say, I'm going to quit my job and go pursue another job, well, I wouldn't necessarily quit it unless you for sure have a fully funded emergency fund. That way, whether it's going to take you 3 months or 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, etc., you're going to have that money set aside to make sure you can pay for food, shelter, whether that's rent, mortgage, insurance, etc. So when it comes to that, make sure you have your savings tucked away.
And I want to take another moment to say hello to some of our guests who are watching internationally, including Jan from Congo and Janice from Canada. Thanks for joining us. So let's talk about something that's going to happen a little bit farther in the future. We know that after the new year, there's going to be this end to the freeze on federal student loans. Probably a lot of the young people that watch you and watch your explainers, this might affect them and their ability to act with their money. What's the important things that we need to know about that event coming up after the new year?
Yeah, great question. And I think we come back full circle. It has to start with what your budget is, right? Now you have a new line item, right? I think we discussed this, especially during the lockdown, and the government came out and said, we're going to freeze all student loans, right? 0% interest rate. We're going to freeze and we're going to stop collections as well. And what that did is gave the average consumer, right? And this actually impacts about 40 million borrowers. So it actually gave them the ability, if they had actually lost their job, to now focus their attention in making general, basic ends meet. And I think that now that this is actually getting ready to end, I want to say it ends at the end of January. Now you have to look at that and say, okay, am I in a healthy position, right? Do I have a job? Do I have savings? If this is the case, now you want to, just go back to that budget line item and actually put in your actual college student loan interest rate. Right now, it's like, okay, this is a line item, and I think at the end of the day, you have to pay it. So, it's just a normal line item. Continue to write it down. That way, you could actually plan ahead. That way, you can say, okay, maybe I'm not going to go out to eat this month, or I will forego all of the different streaming platforms that I have. Whatever it is, I think everything starts with the budget. And one of the most important things is actually write it down. It gives you that ability to just see everything, right? And I think, not a lot of people want to write it down. It's not sexy, but nonetheless, I think it's sometimes necessary.
One of the most interesting things I've seen while watching your show is the difference between monthly due dates from lenders and the dates on which those lenders actually report your credit history. Can you explain why that's important, especially as we're talking about, the fact that this freeze is going to end and many people have been actually thinking about paying down debt over this time when they had this benefit in their back pocket?
Yeah, great question. At the end of the day, when you're thinking about your overall credit score, there are a lot of things that go into it. But one of the things is actually the credit utilization, right? And one of the things you mentioned was like the reporting period, when your actual credit card will report to the credit bureaus. And then you also have when your actual credit card bill is actually due. So I would say on average, 9 times out of 10, almost always, right? You're reporting, they're going to report to the credit bureau before the actual due date. And so why this is important is because you want to take heed to actually understanding what the credit utilization is. So for instance, suppose you have a $10,000 credit limit, right? And if your bill is due on the first of the month, and just say, your credit card company is actually going to report on the 25th. So call it, 4 or 5 days or whatever, 5-6 days before your due date. Well, the reality is if you have, for instance, a $4,000 credit card loan, now you're carrying a 40% utilization. So regardless if you're going to pay the entire, $4,000 at the end of when it's actually due, what's actually going to get reported to the credit bureau is that, this person actually has a 40% credit utilization, and that is actually going to be deemed as not good. So it's actually going to be a check mark against you. So why you want to take heed to this is because on average, I always tell people to keep your credit utilization under 30%. If you're really doing well, keep it under 15%. But why you want to take, why this is important is because you want to make sure you're trying to pay this down before your credit card company is actually reporting that to the credit bureau.
Mm. And I know that you're someone who pays attention to a lot of statistics that's reported in the news about, consumer habits and Americans' personal finances. What's one of the more surprising numbers that you've seen about just Americans' personal finances over the past couple months?
Yeah, I saw a few stats, right? A few of them is like, over 50% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. I want to say nearly 70% of Americans have less than $1,000 saved. And another statistic was that the average millennial who makes over $100,000 still lives paycheck to paycheck. And it was funny because, I had a debate with my community, and some people's like, that doesn't make sense. How do you make 6 figures and you still live paycheck to paycheck? Well, what ended up happening, if you live in a city, for instance, like New York City, you start to understand, the quality of life is a little different there. It's a little more expensive, and that $1,000 can go quickly because one thing you obviously have to take into account is Uncle Sam. So $1,000 is not really what's going to be, your take home pay, right? So you got to take taxes out, then you got rent, you got travel, you're dining out, all of your other things that you want to do when it comes to, other expenses. But I think at the end of the day, those are some of the more, alarming statistics. But I do understand how it is able to happen. But with all 3 of those statistics, right? Over 50% of people living paycheck to paycheck, more than, about 70% of people having less than $1,000 in their savings. I think everything comes back full circle. You want to have a very strong budget plan. That way you're able to control your inflows and outflows. And now you're able to actually prioritize, where's my actual money going? You know what, let me forego this because I want to start building up my savings. Or here's my plan to actually start getting out of debt. But that's kind of how I look at that.
We have another question from the stream here where Janice asks, do you have any advice for people trying to bounce back from bankruptcy and rebuilding their credit? What exactly is that process like? Hopefully you don't know from firsthand experience.
Yeah, well, I don't know. However, what I will say is that the process itself is going to be very similar, right? Just to be clear, right? If you have something on your credit that has been there for several years, right? I want to say after 7 years, it could actually fall off your credit report. So that's one thing to start thinking about, right? Because this is a negative going towards your credit. It will fall off your credit after 7 years. But at the end of the day, one of the strong things you want to do is just start establishing strong, credit history, right? You want to start showing that you're paying your bills on time. If that starts with you actually getting a securitized credit card, right? Whether it's $200-$300 prepaid credit card, right? And that gives you the ability to now start showing to credit bureaus, this person is becoming more credit worthy. If you have some people disagree with this, but if you have a very, a close family friend who has a very strong credit score, another thing is, can you please add me to your credit card as an authorized user? What that does for you is it's going to give you effectively their credit profile. It's going to show you what their limit is. So now that if that person has, $20,000, spending limit, that now is going to be mirrored towards you. So the only negative to that is that if they're not paying their bills, obviously that's a negative to you. But, I've done this for family members. One thing I do is I say, if I'm going to make you an authorized user, once your credit card comes, right, because it's literally you putting their name on your credit card, same exact, credit card number, etc. All you do is just cut up their credit card. So now what you're trying to do is help them, have more positive things on their credit profile.
And we have some comments in the stream. Among them is Payman, who says, "Thank you for this. This has been very informative." I mean, Ross, I just want to end on one simple question. I think we've seen an increase of people thinking about some of these topics, whether it's the stat that I mentioned before about people thinking about changing industries or more people thinking about their own financial independence. Why do you think there's been this increase of people thinking about these subjects over the past, let's say, year or 18 months?
I think people are understanding. If I look at that and I actually say what has happened over the past year, most people have actually gotten a lot more comfortable working from home. And as a result, their quality of life has changed. And more importantly, they're starting to see that there might be other methods that will give them the exact same lifestyle they want, or they don't want to return back to their workplace environment. Nonetheless, when you start hearing statistics about 50% or more than 50% of people want to actually change their field, at the end of the day, right, you just want to look at it for face value and say, okay, how can we help those people get closer to their end goal? Is it a higher paying job? Is it just a better quality of life? At the end of the day, as we are, starting to hopefully defeat COVID, right? I think that as we continue to progress, there are going to be more opportunities, right? Like I stated earlier, we have the gig economy where you're able to do so many things from your home, right? Whether it's you putting, renting out your car on Turo, renting out an extra room on Airbnb, the list goes on. But if it comes to truly changing careers, once again, I will say start out making sure you have that fully funded emergency fund. That way you'll be in good hands.
Ross, thanks so much for joining us. It was great to have you.
I'm so grateful. Thanks so much, Joe, for the opportunity. Everybody, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find me on any social platform at I'm Ross Mack, or shoot me a text message, 773-232-2577. Thanks for everything.
All right. And that was Ross Mack, financial educator and host of Macconomics on Revolt TV. And thank you for your comments for everybody who was watching in the stream. You can continue the conversation or check out other stories to the right of your feed. Or if you're on mobile, click into the search box. On Thursday, we're honoring Veterans Day when my colleague, Caroline Fairchild, will be talking about female veterans in the workforce and career transitions out of the military into civilian life. Be sure to check that out. I'm Joe Millard once again, and thanks for watching LinkedIn News Live.